There are 1.7 million Purple Heart recipients living in America today, but most people would never recognize one of them sleeping homeless outside a VA hospital. Thomas Mitchell kept his medal hidden for a reason, not shame about his service, but shame about how far he'd fallen since returning from Afghanistan with shrapnel wounds and invisible scars the system couldn't heal. For 3 years, he'd been invisible to everyone except Dr. Amanda Rodriguez, who passed him every morning on her way to treat other veterans inside the building. Until the day she discovered that the quiet man in the doorway possessed one of the military's highest honors, and everything she understood about veteran care changed forever. Welcome to Veteran Stories. Before we continue this powerful story of hidden honor, systemic failure, and the moment when one doctor's compassion revealed the tragic irony of a decorated hero forgotten by the system he'd served, tell me in the comments which city you're watching from today. And if you believe our veterans deserve better than this, hit that subscribe button and help us share stories that demand change. The doorway of the Phoenix VA Medical Center provided minimal shelter from Arizona's desert elements, but it had been Thomas Mitchell's home for 3 years, 2 months, and 16 days. At 62, he'd learned to make himself invisible, a skill that served him well on the streets, but hadn't been necessary during his 24 years in the Army. Thomas arranged his few possessions with military precision each morning before the hospital opened. A worn sleeping bag donated by a church group 2 winters ago, a military surplus blanket that had seen better decades, 2 shopping bags containing everything else he owned, a change of clothes, some basic hygiene items, and a few personal effects he couldn't bear to lose. Most importantly, hidden beneath a piece of cardboard that served as his pillow, was a small wooden box containing a medal he'd earned through blood and sacrifice in Afghanistan's Helmand province. The Purple Heart represented the moment his life had changed forever, not just from the shrapnel that had torn through his left leg and abdomen, but from the invisible wounds that had proven more devastating than any physical injury. Dr. Amanda Rodriguez arrived at the VA Medical Center every morning at 6:45 a.m., exactly 15 minutes before her shift began. She'd worked in veteran care for 8 years, specializing in trauma surgery and post-combat medical treatment. She knew the statistics by heart. 11,000 homeless veterans in Arizona alone, 40,000 nationwide, with PTSD and substance abuse complicating their recovery from both visible and invisible wounds. Thomas was part of those statistics, though Dr. Rodriguez didn't know his story. She saw him every morning, a quiet presence who never bothered anyone, never asked for anything, never caused problems that would bring security attention. He was polite when spoken to, careful not to block foot traffic, and gone by evening when the last shift ended. Like most hospital staff, Dr. Rodriguez had learned to see Thomas without really seeing him, a defense mechanism that prevented emotional burnout in a system overwhelmed by needs it couldn't fully address. The Phoenix VA Medical Center served over 165,000 veterans across Arizona, providing medical care, mental health services, and benefits administration for men and women who'd served their country in conflicts spanning from Vietnam to Afghanistan. The facility was modern, well-equipped, and staffed with dedicated professionals who'd committed their careers to veteran care. But like VA hospitals nationwide, it struggled with capacity, funding, and the complex challenges of treating combat trauma that often manifested years or decades after service ended. Wait times for mental health appointments averaged 6 weeks. Housing assistance programs had months-long waiting lists. Disability claim processing could take years. For Thomas, the system's contradictions were personal and immediate. He was eligible for VA healthcare, but mental health appointments were scheduled weeks apart. Not helpful when PTSD episodes hit without warning. He qualified for housing assistance, but available units were limited and application processes required documentation he'd lost during periods of unstable housing. Most ironically, Thomas was a decorated combat veteran whose service-connected disabilities made him a priority case for VA benefits. But navigating the bureaucracy required skills, patience, and mental clarity that PTSD and chronic pain had compromised. Each failed attempt to access services had increased his sense of hopelessness, creating a cycle where the symptoms that qualified him for help also prevented him from receiving it. Thomas's presence outside the VA hospital wasn't a choice. It was a result of a system that acknowledged his sacrifices in principle, but couldn't provide practical solutions for his daily survival. The Purple Heart had been awarded to Thomas on March 15, 2012, at Forward Operating Base Shank in Afghanistan's Logar province. He'd been serving as a staff sergeant with the 10th Mountain Division when an improvised explosive device had detonated near his convoy, sending shrapnel through his leg and abdomen while killing his vehicle commander, Sergeant First Class David Park. Thomas had survived his physical wounds, though they'd left him with chronic pain and limited mobility. But the psychological trauma of losing soldiers under his command had created wounds that the Army's medical system wasn't equipped to heal. PTSD, survivor's guilt, and chronic depression had developed gradually, their symptoms initially dismissed as normal adjustment difficulties that would resolve with time. By the time Thomas's mental health challenges were properly diagnosed, he'd already been discharged from active duty with disability ratings that provided monthly compensation but no ongoing support structure. Civilian employment proved difficult with his physical limitations and PTSD symptoms. Relationships became strained as untreated trauma affected his ability to connect with family and friends. The downward spiral had been gradual but relentless. Lost jobs led to unstable housing. Untreated PTSD led to alcohol dependency. Medical bills exhausted disability payments. Within 2 years of his discharge, Thomas had become one of the invisible veterans, men and women whose service-related injuries had led to homelessness despite their eligibility for benefits they couldn't successfully navigate. The Purple Heart remained his most precious possession, not because of its monetary value, but because it represented the last time his sacrifice had been officially recognized. Hidden beneath his cardboard pillow, it was both a reminder of honor earned and a symbol of promises broken. Dr. Rodriguez had been noticing small details about Thomas that suggested his background was more complex than typical homelessness. His military bearing persisted despite his circumstances, the way he maintained his small space, his polite interaction with hospital staff, his habit of standing at attention when spoken to by anyone in uniform. More telling were the moments when Thomas didn't think anyone was watching. The way he reflexively scanned his environment for potential threats. His precise, economical movements that suggested military training. The careful way he handled his possessions, as if organizational habits from decades of service remained intact despite his current situation. Dr. Rodriguez had seen similar behaviors in her patients, combat veterans whose military training remained embedded in their actions even when trauma had disrupted their ability to function in civilian society. Thomas's demeanor suggested someone who'd held responsibility and authority, whose current circumstances represented a dramatic change from his previous life. But hospital policy and professional boundaries discouraged staff from engaging with homeless individuals beyond basic courtesy. The assumption was that social services and VA benefits counselors would address housing and support needs, while medical staff focused on healthcare delivery. This separation of responsibilities often meant that veterans like Thomas fell through gaps between systems, too complex for social services to address quickly, too stable for emergency intervention, but not sick enough to qualify for immediate housing assistance. Arizona desert winds could be unpredictable and powerful, particularly during spring months when temperature differentials created sudden gusts that swept through the valley. On the morning that changed everything, such a wind struck the VA Medical Center at exactly 6:47 a.m., 2 minutes after Dr. Rodriguez had parked her car and begun walking toward the hospital entrance. The gust scattered loose debris across the parking lot and lifted anything not securely anchored. Thomas's cardboard pillow, which had seemed adequately weighted by the small wooden box beneath it, caught the wind and tumbled across the sidewalk. Dr. Rodriguez instinctively moved to help Thomas gather his scattered possessions, a human response that overcame professional distance. As she bent to retrieve the cardboard, she saw what Thomas had been protecting. A wooden presentation case containing a Purple Heart medal, its distinctive purple and gold ribbon as pristine as the day it had been awarded. Dr. Rodriguez had seen Purple Hearts before, usually in display cases or worn by veterans during ceremonies. but she'd never seen one in the possession of a homeless man, carefully preserved beneath the bedding of someone society had stopped seeing. The medal represented more than military recognition. It was proof of sacrifice, evidence of service, and documentation of wounds received in defense of a country that had somehow failed to prevent its recipient from sleeping in a hospital doorway. "Sir," Dr. Rodriguez said quietly, still holding the wooden case, "is this yours?" Thomas looked at her with the expression of someone who'd been caught protecting something precious. "Yes, ma'am." "Purple Heart, Afghanistan." "Yes, ma'am." 2012. Dr. Rodriguez felt something shift in her understanding. This wasn't just a homeless veteran. This was a combat-wounded hero whose sacrifices had been recognized at the highest levels of military honor. "What's your name?" "Thomas Mitchell. Staff Sergeant, retired." "How long have you been out here?" Thomas was quiet for a moment, calculating. 3 years, give or take. Dr. Rodriguez looked at the medal, then at Thomas, then at the VA medical center behind them, the facility designed to serve veterans exactly like him. "Sir, are you receiving VA benefits?" "Some. Disability compensation. But the housing programs." Thomas trailed off, unwilling to criticize the system that was supposed to help him. "Have you tried the VA housing assistance programs?" "Yes, ma'am. Wait list is about 18 months. Temporary housing is full. Emergency shelter is." He paused again. "Let's just say it's not suitable for someone with my particular challenges." Dr. Rodriguez understood. Veterans with PTSD often couldn't tolerate crowded, noisy shelter environments that triggered combat-related anxiety responses. Dr. Rodriguez spent her lunch break researching Thomas's case through VA medical records she was authorized to access. What she found was a tragic example of systemic failure disguised as bureaucratic efficiency. Thomas had exemplary military records, 24 years of service, multiple deployments, commendations for leadership under combat conditions, and the Purple Heart awarded for wounds received while leading soldiers under enemy fire. His medical records documented physical injuries that had healed successfully and mental health challenges that had been inadequately addressed. His disability rating was 80% service-connected, providing monthly compensation of $1,778, enough for basic living expenses if housing were available, but insufficient for market-rate apartments in Phoenix's inflated rental market. More problematically, his PTSD symptoms made it difficult to maintain steady employment that could supplement his disability income. Thomas had applied for VA housing assistance multiple times over 3 years, but qualified units remained unavailable. He'd been placed on waiting lists for specialized veteran housing programs, but those lists moved slowly and offered no interim solutions. Most frustratingly, Thomas's case represented exactly the type of veteran that VA housing programs were designed to serve: combat wounded, homeless, and highly vulnerable. But program capacity couldn't meet demand, leaving decorated heroes like Thomas to survive on the streets while waiting for assistance. Dr. Rodriguez made a decision that violated professional boundaries but aligned with moral obligations. She approached Thomas at the end of her shift with information she'd gathered about alternative resources and an offer of personal assistance. "Staff Sergeant Mitchell," she said, using his military rank intentionally, "I've been researching your situation. There are some options we might explore." Thomas looked surprised. "Ma'am, you don't need to." "Yes, I do. You're a Purple Heart recipient sleeping outside the hospital that's supposed to be serving you. That's not acceptable." Dr. Rodriguez had identified a nonprofit organization that specialized in rapid rehousing for disabled veterans, a VA social worker who could expedite Thomas's housing applications, and a veterans service organization that provided emergency assistance for basic needs. More importantly, she'd learned that Thomas's case qualified for several programs he hadn't been informed about, benefits that could provide immediate housing assistance while longer-term solutions were developed. "Sir, would you be willing to work with me on this? I can't promise immediate solutions, but I can promise that you won't have to navigate this alone anymore." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, studying the woman who was offering help without judgment or conditions. "Why?" he asked finally. because you earned better treatment than this. And because I took an oath to help people, not just the ones who can afford to come inside the building. Dr. Rodriguez's intervention began what Thomas later described as the most intensive week of his 3 years on the streets. She'd coordinated with VA social services, nonprofit organizations, and veteran advocacy groups to address Thomas's situation comprehensively rather than through the fragmented approach that had previously failed him. The first breakthrough came when a VA social worker reviewed Thomas's case with the urgency it deserved. His combination of service-connected disabilities, housing instability, and vulnerability to victimization qualified him for emergency housing placement, a program Thomas hadn't known existed because information about it wasn't systematically provided to homeless veterans. Within 48 hours, Thomas was moved to transitional housing operated by a veteran service organization. Not permanent housing, but a safe, stable environment where he could begin addressing the complex challenges that had led to his homelessness. The second breakthrough was connecting Thomas with specialized mental health services designed for combat veterans with PTSD. His previous VA mental health treatment had been generic therapy that didn't address the specific triggers and symptoms related to combat trauma and survivor's guilt. Dr. Rodriguez had identified a VA program specifically for veterans struggling with both mental health and housing issues, an integrated approach that treated both problems simultaneously rather than separately. Thomas's recovery wasn't immediate or simple, but it was systematic and supported. The transitional housing program provided stability while he worked with mental health professionals who understood combat trauma. Specialized PTSD treatment addressed symptoms that had been barriers to employment and stable relationships. More importantly, Thomas was connected with other veterans who'd experienced similar challenges and recovered. Peer support from people who understood his specific struggles proved more effective than traditional counseling approaches. Within 6 months, Thomas had moved to permanent supportive housing designed for disabled veterans. His PTSD symptoms were being effectively managed through treatment that addressed combat-specific trauma. He'd begun volunteer work with a veteran service organization that had helped him, using his own experience to help other homeless veterans navigate systems that were often incomprehensible. Dr. Rodriguez maintained contact with Thomas throughout his recovery, not as his doctor, but as someone who'd witnessed his transformation and wanted to ensure his continued progress. "Ma'am," Thomas told her during one of their coffee meetings, "you saved my life. But more than that, you reminded me that my service still mattered to someone." Thomas's recovery had taken place with assistance from systems that existed but weren't easily accessible to veterans who needed them most. Dr. Rodriguez realized that his case represented a broader, systemic problem that required advocacy beyond individual intervention. She began documenting cases of homeless veterans who were receiving inadequate assistance despite their eligibility for comprehensive benefits. Her research revealed that Thomas's experience was common. Qualified veterans unable to access services because of bureaucratic complexity, insufficient program capacity, and lack of coordinated case management. Dr. Rodriguez testified before congressional committees about veteran homelessness, using Thomas's story, with his permission, to illustrate how decorated combat veterans could fall through cracks in systems designed to serve them. Her advocacy contributed to legislative changes that expanded veteran housing programs, streamlined application processes, and required coordinated case management for veterans with multiple service-connected disabilities. 2 years after their first conversation about the Purple Heart, Thomas had become a full-time advocate for homeless veterans. His understanding of both military service and homelessness made him uniquely qualified to help other veterans navigate systems that were often designed by people who'd never experienced either military service or housing instability. Thomas worked with the same nonprofit organization that had helped him, specializing in outreach to homeless veterans who were avoiding traditional services because of negative past experiences or PTSD symptoms that made it difficult to trust institutional assistance. The hardest part, Thomas explained to Dr. Rodriguez, isn't convincing veterans to accept help. It's convincing them that the system won't fail them again like it failed them before. His approach was based on understanding that many homeless veterans had attempted to access services multiple times before giving up. Building trust required demonstrating that this time would be different, that services would be coordinated, comprehensive, and delivered by people who understood military culture and combat trauma. 3 years after Dr. Rodriguez discovered Thomas's Purple Heart, he received recognition that went beyond his original military service. The nonprofit organization that had helped him recover presented Thomas with a Community Service Award for his work helping other homeless veterans. But the recognition that meant most to Thomas came from Dr. Rodriguez, who nominated him for a VA Volunteer Service Award that acknowledged his contributions to veteran care. Staff Sergeant Mitchell, Dr. Rodriguez said during the award ceremony, represents the best of military service, the commitment to leave no one behind. He's applied that principle to his work with homeless veterans, ensuring that others don't fall through the same cracks that once trapped him. Thomas accepted the award on behalf of all homeless veterans, particularly those who remained invisible to systems designed to serve them. This award belongs to every veteran who's sleeping rough tonight, Thomas said during his acceptance speech. And it's a reminder that we all have responsibility to ensure that military service leads to honor and support, not abandonment and homelessness. Dr. Rodriguez's advocacy and Thomas's recovery story contributed to broader changes in how the VA addressed veteran homelessness. New protocols required coordinated case management for veterans with multiple service-connected disabilities, ensuring that housing, mental health, and medical services were delivered systematically rather than separately. Training programs for VA staff now included education about military culture and combat trauma, helping medical professionals understand how service-related injuries could lead to homelessness despite veterans' eligibility for comprehensive benefits. Most importantly, the VA implemented outreach programs specifically designed to connect with homeless veterans who were avoiding traditional services. These programs, often staffed by formerly homeless veterans like Thomas, provided culturally competent assistance that acknowledged veterans' past negative experiences while offering genuine hope for recovery. 5 years after discovering Thomas's Purple Heart outside the VA Medical Center, Dr. Rodriguez reflected on how one moment of human compassion had created ripple effects that extended far beyond individual recovery. Thomas had not only recovered from homelessness, but had become a leader in veteran advocacy. His work had helped hundreds of other veterans access services and housing. His story had contributed to policy changes that improved veteran care nationwide. Dr. Thomas said during one of their regular coffee meetings, "Do you ever think about how different things would be if you just walked past that morning?" Dr. Rodriguez considered this. "I think about it every day. But I also think about how many other Thomas Mitchells are out there right now, waiting for someone to see their purple hearts beneath the cardboard." Thomas nodded. That's why the work continues. Because behind every homeless veteran is a story of service and sacrifice that deserves recognition and support. At 67, Thomas continued his advocacy work while living independently in permanent supportive housing designed for disabled veterans. His Purple Heart was displayed prominently in his apartment, no longer hidden, but celebrated as a symbol of service that had led to meaningful recovery and continued mission. Dr. Rodriguez had incorporated veteran homelessness awareness into her medical practice, training younger doctors to recognize signs of combat trauma and understand how service-related injuries could lead to housing instability. Together, they created a model for how individual compassion could address systemic problems, demonstrating that veteran homelessness wasn't inevitable, but was a solvable problem requiring coordinated effort and genuine commitment. "The most important thing I learned," Dr. Rodriguez reflected, "is that behind every homeless veteran is someone who once raised their right hand and swore to defend this country. Our obligation doesn't end when their service ends." Thomas's story continued to inspire other homeless veterans to seek assistance and other advocates to work for systemic change. His Purple Heart, once hidden beneath cardboard, had become a symbol of hope for veterans who'd lost faith in the systems designed to serve them. Every morning, as Dr. Rodriguez walked past the doorway where Thomas had once slept, She remembered that heroism takes many forms. Sometimes it's earning a medal in combat, and sometimes it's helping someone reclaim the dignity that medal represents. Thomas Mitchell's Purple Heart was earned through blood and sacrifice on a battlefield in Afghanistan. But his greatest victory came on the streets of Phoenix, when one person finally saw past homelessness to recognize the honor beneath. Dr. Amanda Rodriguez's decision to help Thomas wasn't just an act of individual compassion. It was a reminder that our obligations to veterans extend beyond ceremonies and thank you speeches to include practical support for the challenges they face long after their service ends. Thomas's story represents both the tragic failure of systems that allowed decorated heroes to become homeless and the hopeful possibility of recovery when those systems work as intended. His transformation from invisible homeless veteran to recognized advocate demonstrates that it's never too late to honor service and never too late to provide the support that veterans have earned. The Purple Heart beneath the cardboard wasn't just a medal. It was a symbol of promises made and promises that must be kept, not just during military service, but throughout veterans' lives. So now I ask you, have you ever walked past someone whose story you didn't know, whose service you didn't recognize, whose dignity was hidden by circumstances beyond their control? Share their story in the comments. Tell us where you're watching from. Because at Veteran Stories, we believe that every veteran deserves recognition for their service and support for their challenges, and that sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones society has stopped seeing. Subscribe if stories like this matter to you. Because every community has veterans who need advocates, and every veteran story deserves to be told with the honor and respect their service has earned.